Well, hello, and welcome back to another episode of A People's Historian. I'm so glad you could join me. My name is Jason Kishinev. Each time we read about 30 minutes of a history book together. We're reading People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We're in chapter 22, and we're discussing the very beginning of the First Iraq War under George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., Poppy Bush, George W.'s father. Would you go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button that you see right there and that notification bell? See it? Thanks. Let's dig in. 10 days before the bombing began, at a town meeting in Boulder, Colorado, with 800 people present, the question was put, do you support Bush's policy for war? Only 4 people raised their hands. A few days before the war began, 4,000 people in Santa Fe, New Mexico, blocked a 4-lane highway for an hour, asking that there be no war. Residents said this was larger than any demonstration in the Vietnam era. On the eve of war, 6,000 people marched through Ann Arbor, Michigan to ask for peace. On the night the war began, 5,000 people gathered in San Francisco to denounce the war and formed a human chain around the Federal Building. Police broke the chain by swinging their clubs at the hands of the protesters, but the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed a resolution declaring the city and county a sanctuary for those who, for moral or ethic or religious reasons, cannot participate in war. The night before Bush gave the order to launch the bombing, a 7-year-old girl in Lexington, Massachusetts, told her mother she wanted to write a letter to the president. Her mother suggested it was late and she should write the next day. No, tonight, the girl said. She was still learning to write, so she dictated a letter. Dear President Bush, I don't like the way you are behaving. If you would make up your mind there won't be a war, we won't have to have peace vigils. If you were in a war, you wouldn't want to get hurt. What I'm saying is, I don't want any fighting to happen. Sincerely yours, Serena Chpt. After the bombing of Iraq began along with the bombardment of public opinion, the polls showed overwhelming support for Bush's action, and this continued through the 6 weeks of the war. But was it an accurate reflection of the citizenry's long-term feelings about war? The split vote in the polls just before the war reflected a public still thinking its opinion might have an effect. Once the war was on and clearly irreversible, in an atmosphere charged with patriotic fervor, the president of the United Church of Christ spoke of the steady drumbeat of war messages. It was not surprising that a great majority of the country would declare its support. Nevertheless, even with little time to organize and with the war over very fast, there was an opposition. A minority for sure, but a determined one, and with the potential to grow. Compared to the first months of the military escalation in Vietnam, the movement against the Gulf War expanded with extraordinary speed and vigor. The first week of the war, while it was clear most Americans were supporting Bush's action, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in protest in towns and cities all over the country. In Athens, Ohio, over 100 people were arrested as they clashed with a pro-war group. In Portland, Maine, 500 marched wearing white armbands or carrying white paper crosses with one word, "Why?" written in red. At the University of Georgia, 70 students opposed to the war held an all-night vigil, and in the Georgia legislature, Representative Cynthia McKinnon made a speech attacking the bombing of Iraq, leading many of the other legislators to walk off the floor. She held her ground, and it seemed that there had been at least some change in thinking since Representative Julian Bond was expelled from the very same legislature for criticizing the war in Vietnam during the 1960s. At a junior high school in Newton, Massachusetts, 350 students marched to City Hall to present a petition to the mayor declaring their opposition to the war in the Gulf. Excuse me. Read the wrong line there for a minute. Clearly, many were trying to reconcile their feelings about war with their sympathy for soldiers sent to the Middle East. A student leader, Carly Baker, said, "We don't think bloodshed is the right way. We are supporting the troops and are proud of them, but we don't want war." In Ada, Oklahoma, while East Central Oklahoma State University was adopting 2 National Guard units, 2 young women sat quietly on top of the concrete entrance gate with signs that read, "Teach peace, not war." One of them, Patricia Biggs, said, "I don't think we should be over there. I don't think it's about justice and liberty. I think it's about economics. The big oil corporations have a lot to do with what is going on over there. We are risking people's lives for money." 4 days after the United States launched its air attack, 75,000 people, the estimate of the Capitol Police, marched in Washington, rallying near the White House to denounce the war. In Southern California, Ron Kovich addressed 6,000 people who chanted, "Peace now." In Fayetteville, Arkansas, a group supporting military policy was confronted by the Northwest Arkansas Citizens Against War, who marched carrying a flag-draped coffin and a banner that read, "Bring them home alive." Another disabled Vietnam veteran, a professor of history and political science at York College in Pennsylvania named Philip Avilo, wrote in a local newspaper, "Yes, we need to support our men and women under arms, but let's support them by bringing them home, not by condoning this barbarous, violent policy." And when he said a history professor, I thought he was going to say it was him. In Salt Lake City, hundreds of demonstrators, many with children, marched through city's main streets chanting anti-war slogans. In Vermont, which had just elected socialist Bernie Sanders to Congress, over 2,000 demonstrators disrupted a speech by the governor at the State House. And in Burlington, Vermont's largest city, 300 protesters walked through the downtown area asking shop owners to close their doors in solidarity. On January 26th, 9 days after the beginning of the war, over 150,000 people marched through the streets of Washington, D.C. and listened to speakers denounce the war, including the movie stars Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins, who were married, so of course they were together. A woman from Oakland, California, held up the folded American flag that was given to her when her husband was killed in Vietnam, saying, "I learned the hard way there is no glory in a folded flag." Labor unions had supported the war in Vietnam for the most part, but after the bombing started in the Gulf, 11 affiliates of the AFL-CIO, including some of its more powerful unions like steel, auto, communications, chemical workers, spoke out against the war. The black community was far less enthusiastic than the rest of the country about what the U.S. Air Force was doing to Iraq. An ABC News Washington Post poll in early February 1991 found that support for the war was 84% among whites, but only 48% among African Americans. When the war had been going on for a month, with Iraq devastated by the incessant bombing, there were feelers from Saddam Hussein that Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait if the United States would stop its attacks. Bush rejected the idea. At a meeting of black leaders in New York, sharply criticized him, calling the war an immoral and unspiritual diversion, a blatant evasion of our domestic responsibilities. in Selma, Alabama, which had been the scene of bloody police violence against civil rights marchers 26 years before, a meeting to observe the anniversary of that bloody Sunday demanded that our troops be brought home alive to fight for justice at home. The father of a 21-year-old Marine in the Persian Gulf, Alex Molnar, wrote an angry open letter published in the New York Times to President Bush. "Where were you, Mr. President, when Iraq was killing its own people with poison gas? Why, until the recent crisis, was it business as usual with Saddam Hussein, the man you now call a Hitler? Is the American way of life that you say my son is risking his life for the continued right of Americans to consume 25 to 30% of the world's oil? I intend to support my son and his fellow soldiers by doing everything I can to oppose any offensive American military action in the Persian Gulf." There were courageous individual acts by citizens speaking out in spite of threats. Peg Mullen of Brownsville, Texas, whose son had been killed by friendly fire in Vietnam, organized a busload of mothers to protest in Washington in spite of a warning that her house would be burned down if she persisted. And I wonder if it was. He doesn't say. The actress Margot Kidder, who played Lois Lane in the Superman films, despite the risk to her career, spoke out eloquently against the war. And didn't have much of a career after that. I wonder if that's why. Well, I mean, it probably was. A basketball player for Seton Hall University in New Jersey refused to wear the American flag on his uniform. And when he became the object of derision for this, he left the team and the university and returned to his native Italy. More tragically, a Vietnam veteran in Los Angeles set fire to himself and died to protest the war. In Amherst, Massachusetts, a young man carrying a cardboard peace sign knelt on the town commons, poured 2 cans of flammable fluid on himself, struck 2 matches, and died in the flames. 2 hours later, students from nearby universities gathered on the common for a candlelight vigil and placed peace signs at the site of the death. One of the signs read, "Stop this crazy war." There was no time, as there had been during the Vietnam conflict, for a large anti-war movement to develop in the military, but there were men and women who defied their commanders and refused to participate in the war. When the first contingents of U.S. troops were being sent to Saudi Arabia in August of 1990, Corporal Jeff Patterson, a 22-year-old Marine stationed in Hawaii, sat down on the runway of the airfield and refused to board a plane bound for Saudi Arabia. He asked to be discharged from the Marine Corps. "I have come to believe that there are no justified wars. I began to question exactly what I was doing in the Marine Corps about the time I began to read about history." Must have been reading this book. "I began to read up on America's support for the murderous regimes of Guatemala, Iran under the Shah, and El Salvador. I object to the military use of force against any people, anywhere, anytime." 14 Marine Corps reservists at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, filed for conscientious observer status, despite the prospect of a court-martial for desertion. A lance corporal in the Marines, Eric Larson, issued a statement. "I declare myself a conscientious objector. Here is my sea bag full of personal gear. Here is my gas mask. I no longer need them. I am no longer a Marine. It to me is embarrassing to fight for a way of life in which basic human needs, like a place to sleep, 1 hot meal a day, and some medical attention, cannot even be met in our nation's capital." Yolanda Hewitt Vaughn, a physician who was a captain in the Army Reserve Medical Corps, a mother of 3 young children and a member of the Physicians for Social Responsibility, was called to active duty in December 1990, a month before the start of the war. She replied, "I am refusing orders to be an accomplice in what I consider an immoral, inhumane, and unconstitutional act, namely an offensive military mobilization in the Middle East." She was court-martialed, convicted of desertion, and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Another soldier, Stephanie Atkinson of Murfreesboro, Illinois, refused to report for active duty, saying she thought the U.S. military was in the Persian Gulf solely for economic reasons. She was first placed under house arrest, then given a discharge under other than honorable conditions. An Army physician named Harlow Ballard, stationed at Fort Devens in Massachusetts, refused to follow an order to go to Saudi Arabia. "I would rather go to jail than support this war," he said. "I don't believe there is any such thing as a just war." Over 1,000 reservists declared themselves conscientious objectors. A 23-year-old Marine Corps reservist named Rob Calabro was one of them. Calabro, not really sure. "My father," this is him talking, "my father tells me that he's ashamed of me. He screams at me that he's embarrassed by me. But I believe that killing people is morally wrong. I believe I'm serving my country more by being true to my conscience than by living a lie." And I think you are, Rob. An information network sprang up during the Gulf War to tell what was not being told in the major media. There were alternative newspapers in many cities. There were over 100 community radio stations, able to reach only a fraction of those tuned in to the major networks, but the only sources during the Gulf War of critical analyses of the war. An ingenious radio person in Boulder, Colorado, named David Barsamian, recorded a speech by Noam Chomsky made at Harvard, a devastating critique of the war. He then sent the cassette out to his network of community stations, which were eager for a point of view different from the original one. 2 young men in New Jersey then transcribed the talk, put it in pamphlet form in a shape easily photocopied, and placed the pamphlets in bookstores all over the country. After victorious wars, there is almost always a sobering effect as the war fervor wears off and citizens assess the cost and wonder what was gained. War fever was at its height in February 1991. In that month, when people being polled were reminded of the huge costs of the war, only 17% said the war was not worth it. 4 months later, in June, the figure was 30%. In the months that followed, Bush's support in the nation dropped steeply as economic conditions deteriorated, and in 1992, with the war spirit evaporated, Bush went down in defeat. After the disintegration of the Soviet bloc began in 1989, there had been talk in the United States of a peace dividend, the opportunity to take billions of dollars from the military budget and use it for like they're gonna get away with that. Sorry, ain't gonna happen. All right. There had been talk in the United States of a peace dividend, the opportunity to take billions of dollars from the military budget and use it for human needs. The war in the Gulf became a convenient excuse for the government determined to stop such talk. A member of the Bush administration said, they called him Saddam, "We owe Saddam a favor. He saved us from the peace dividend." But the idea of a peace dividend could not be stifled so long as Americans were in need. Shortly after the war, historian Marilyn Young warned, "The U.S. can destroy Iraq's highways, but not build its own, create the conditions for epidemic in Iraq, but not offer health care to millions of Americans. It can excoriate Iraqi treatment of the Kurdish minority, but not deal with domestic race relations, create homelessness abroad, but not solve it here, keep 500,000 troops drug-free as part of a war, but refuse to fund the treatment of millions of drug addicts at home. We shall lose the war after we have won it. Amen, sister. In 1992, the limits of military victory became apparent during the quincentennial celebrations of Columbus's arrival in the Western Hemisphere. 500 years ago, Columbus and his fellow conquerors had wiped out the native population of Hispaniola. This was followed during the next 4 centuries by the methodical destruction of Indian tribes by the United States government as it marched across the continent. But now there was a dramatic reaction. 500 years later, there was a dramatic reaction. The Indians, the Native Americans, had become a visible force since the 60s and 70s, and in 1992 were joined by other Americans to denounce the quincentennial celebrations. For the first time in all the years that the country had celebrated Columbus Day, there were nationwide protests against honoring a man who had kidnapped, enslaved, mutilated, murdered the natives who greeted his arrival with gifts and friendship. Preparations for the quincentennial began on both sides of the controversy. Official commissions, nationally and in the states, were set up long before the year of the quincentennial. This spurred action by Native Americans. In the summer of 1990, 350 Indians, representatives from all over the hemisphere, met in Quito, Ecuador, at the first intercontinental gathering of indigenous peoples in the Americas, to mobilize against the glorification of the Columbus conquest. The following summer in Davis, California, hey, that's not even far from here, that's like 45 minutes. The following summer in Davis, California, over 100 Native Americans gathered for a follow-up meeting to the Quito Conference. They declared October 12, 1992, International Day of Solidarity with Indigenous People, and resolved to inform the King of Spain that the replicas of Columbus's 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, will not receive permission from the native nations to land in the Western Hemisphere unless he apologizes for the original incursion 500 years ago. The movement grew. The largest ecumenical body in the United States, the National Council of Churches, called on Christians to refrain from celebrating the Columbus quincentennial, saying, "What represented newness of freedom, hope, and opportunity for some was the occasion for oppression, degradation, and genocide for others." The National Endowment for the Humanities funded a traveling expedition called First Encounter, which romanticized the Columbus conquest. When the exhibition opened at the Florida Museum of Natural History, Michelle Diamond, a freshman at the University of Florida, climbed aboard a replica of one of Columbus's ships with a sign reading, "Exhibit teaches racism." She said, "It's a human issue, not just a red issue." Oh, wow. Sorry. That's what it says. She was arrested and charged with trespassing, but demonstrations continued for 16 days against the exhibit. A newspaper called Indigenous Thought began publication in early 1991 to create a link among all the counter-Columbus quincentenary activities. It carried articles by Native Americans about current struggles over land stolen by treaty. In Corpus Christi, Texas, Indians and Chicanos joined to protest the city's celebrations of the quincentennial. A woman named Angelina Mendez spoke for the Chicanos. "The Chicano Nation, in solidarity with our Indian brothers and sisters to the north, come together with them on this day to denounce the atrocity the U.S. government proposes in reenacting the arrival of the Spanish, more specifically the arrival of Cristobal Colon to the shores of this land. The Columbus controversy brought an extraordinary burst of educational and cultural activity. A professor at the University of California at San Diego, Deborah Small, put together an exhibit of over 200 paintings on wood panels called 1492. She juxtaposed words from Columbus's diary with blown-up fragments from 16th century engravings to dramatize the horrors that accompanied Columbus's arrival in the hemisphere. A reviewer wrote that it reminds us in the most vivid way of how the coming of Western-style civilization to the New World doesn't provide us with a sunny tale. You think? When President Bush attacked Iraq in 1991, claiming that he was acting to end the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, a group of Native Americans in Oregon distributed a biting and ironic open letter. I can read. A group of Native Americans in Oregon distributed a biting and ironic open letter. Dear President Bush, please send your assistance in freeing our small nation from occupation. This foreign force occupied our lands to steal our rich resources. They used biological warfare and deceit, killing thousands of elders, children, and women in the process. As they overwhelmed our land, they deposed our leaders and people of our own government, and in its place, they installed their own government systems that yet today control our daily lives in many ways. As in your own words, the occupation and overthrow of one small nation is one too many. Sincerely, an American Indian. The publication Rethinking Schools, which represented socially conscious school teachers all over the country, printed a 100-page book called Rethinking Columbus, featuring articles by Native Americans and others, a critical review of children's books on Columbus, a listing of resources for people wanting more information on Columbus, and more reading material on counter-quincentenary activities. That's not a fair word. Counter-quincentenary. In a few months, 200,000 copies of the book were sold. A Portland, Oregon teacher named Bill Bigelow, who helped put together Rethinking Schools, took a year off from his regular job to tour the country in 1992, giving workshops to other teachers so that they could begin to tell those truths about the Columbus experience that were omitted from the traditional books and class curricula. One of Bigelow's own students wrote to the publisher, Allen and Bacon, with a critique of their history text, The American Spirit. I'll just pick one topic to keep it simple. How about Columbus? No, you didn't lie, but saying, though they had a keen interest in the peoples of the Caribbean, Columbus and his crews were never able to live peacefully among them, makes it seem as if Columbus did no wrong. The reasons for not being able to live peacefully is that he and crew took slaves and killed thousands of Indians for not bringing enough gold. Another student wrote, it seemed to me as if the publishers had just printed up some glory story that was supposed to make us feel more patriotic about our country. They want us to look at our country as great and powerful and forever right. A student named Rebecca wrote, of course the writers of the books probably think it's harmless enough. What does it matter who discovered America really? But the thought that I have been lied to all my life about this and who knows what else really makes me angry. A group was formed on the West Coast called Italian Americans Against Christopher Columbus, saying, when Italian Americans identify with Native people, we are bringing ourselves, each of us, closer to possible change in the world. I think we're going to put a pin on it, and we'll pick it up next time. Thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. I hope you tune in next time. And I do hope you hit that like and subscribe button. And the notification bell. Don't forget the notification bell. Thank you. We'll see you next time.